What would you do if your lifelong dream was met not with celebration, but with judgment and ridicule? When Daniel Carter, a humble farmer, walked into a luxury jet showroom, he wasn't just chasing a dream. He was challenging a world of prejudice that didn't think he belonged. Mocked, dismissed, and underestimated, Daniel faced a choice: walk away defeated or stand tall and prove his worth. His journey is one of resilience, courage, and a powerful lesson in self-respect. Will he rise above the whispers of doubt? Stay tuned to discover the incredible twist that left everyone speechless. But before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. If this story touches your heart, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We have more inspiring stories coming your way tomorrow. Now, let's begin this incredible journey together. The morning sun cast a warm, golden hue over the sprawling city skyline as Daniel Carter's battered old pickup truck rumbled into the airport district. Its engine sputtered faintly as if protesting the journey, but Daniel was used to such quirks. This truck had been with him for over a decade, faithfully hauling loads of produce and tools across the dusty fields of his farm. Today, though, it carried something far more precious: the culmination of years of backbreaking work and unyielding determination. As Daniel stepped out of the truck, his boots hit the asphalt with a soft crunch. Mud still clung stubbornly to the soles, a testament to the life he had built with his own two hands. He adjusted his weathered baseball cap, the sun catching the streaks of gray in his hair. His plaid shirt, worn at the edges, flapped slightly in the breeze. This was no ordinary day for Daniel. It was a day he had dreamed about for as long as he could remember. Before him stood the glass facade of an opulent airplane showroom, its sleek design radiating luxury and sophistication. Inside, pristine jets gleamed under perfectly angled lights, their polished surfaces reflecting every detail of their meticulously crafted exteriors. Each one represented a level of wealth and prestige that seemed worlds away from the quiet simplicity of Daniel's rural existence. But he wasn't here to admire them from afar. Today, Daniel was here to claim one as his own. As he pushed open the heavy glass door, the cool, air-conditioned interior greeted him, a stark contrast to the warmth outside. His footsteps echoed on the marble floor, drawing the attention of the showroom staff and a handful of customers. Heads turned, and conversations paused. Daniel felt the weight of their gazes immediately. A man in a tailored navy suit glanced at him over the top of his designer sunglasses, his expression betraying a mix of curiosity and disdain. Near the reception desk, a woman in a sleek black dress leaned toward her companion and whispered something, prompting a stifled laugh. Daniel heard snippets of their murmurs. "What's someone like him doing here? He looks like he got lost on his way to the hardware store." Daniel straightened his shoulders, refusing to let their comments sink in. He had faced worse in his life: prejudice, hardship, and the unrelenting struggle of being a black farmer, in a world that often underestimated him. This wasn't the first time people had doubted him, and it wouldn't be the last. But he had long since learned that his worth wasn't defined by others' opinions. He walked further into the showroom, his eyes scanning the rows of jets until they landed on a smaller, sleek aircraft near the center of the display. Its silver body shimmered like a jewel under the showroom lights. For Daniel, it wasn't just a plane. It was the embodiment of a dream he had nurtured for decades. This jet represented freedom, success, and the countless sacrifices he had made along the way. Daniel approached the jet slowly, almost reverently. His rough, calloused hand reached out to touch its smooth surface. The cold metal against his fingertips sent a shiver down his spine. He closed his eyes for a moment, imagining the possibilities this plane could bring. No more long hours driving across state lines to deliver produce. No more missing family gatherings because he couldn't get away in time. This jet wasn't just a luxury. It was a key to a better life for him and his loved ones. He thought back to the years of toil on his farm, waking up before dawn and working long after sunset. He remembered the relentless seasons, scorching summers, biting winters, and the moments when everything seemed on the verge of collapse. Through it all, he had persevered, driven by a vision of something greater. This plane was proof that his hard work had paid off, a tangible reward for a lifetime of dedication. As Daniel Carter stood admiring the sleek jet that embodied years of toil and hope, the tension in the room grew palpable. Whispers traveled like ripples through water, each hushed tone louder in implication than in volume. The polished marble floor of the showroom seemed to amplify the judgment in every gaze cast his way. What should have been a celebratory moment felt like walking through a storm of silent disdain. At the far end of the room, Eric Walker, the young and ambitious salesman Daniel had first encountered, leaned against the counter. His lips twisted into a smirk as he whispered to another employee, "Looks like someone got lost on the way to the tractor dealership." The two shared a quiet chuckle, their glances darting toward Daniel as though his very presence were a joke they had been waiting to tell. Eric wasn't the only one who noticed Daniel. A middle-aged woman in a tailored black blazer turned to her companion near the reception desk. "Do you see those boots?" she said, her voice just loud enough to carry. "How quaint. Maybe he's here to clean the planes." Her companion, a man with silver hair and a pinstripe suit, laughed quietly, shaking his head as if in agreement. Daniel heard it all. He wasn't oblivious to the whispers or the stares. He noticed how the receptionist, a young woman named Carla, glanced at him nervously, her professional smile faltering before she quickly turned her attention back to her computer screen. The subtle shifts in body language, the raised eyebrows, and the exchanged smirks were impossible to ignore. Yet, Daniel remained steady, his focus unbroken. This wasn't the first time he had faced such treatment. As a black farmer working in rural communities, he had grown accustomed to being underestimated, overlooked, and outright dismissed. People often judged him by the dirt under his nails or the mud on his boots, never considering the strength and intellect behind his weathered hands. He had long since learned not to let their prejudice define him. Still, the weight of the judgment in the room pressed down on him like a physical force. It wasn't just the remarks or the laughter. It was the unspoken assumption that he didn't belong, that his dream was too grand for someone like him. Eric decided to make his move, sauntering toward Daniel with a practiced air of authority. His sharp suit and polished shoes clicked against the marble as he approached, each step a calculated assertion of control. He stopped just a few feet away, crossing his arms over his chest as his gaze swept over Daniel with thinly veiled disdain. "Sir," Eric began, his tone polite but dripping with condescension, "can I help you with something?" Daniel turned to meet his gaze, his own expression calm and unyielding. "Yes," he said simply, gesturing toward the jet before him. "I'd like to learn more about this aircraft." Eric's smirk widened. "This one?" he asked, feigning surprise. He tilted his head slightly, as though inspecting Daniel for any sign that he might be serious. "Well, this isn't exactly a budget option. Are you sure you're in the right place?" The remark hung in the air, drawing the attention of nearby customers. A man flipping through a glossy brochure chuckled softly, and a young couple seated near the showroom's lounge exchanged knowing looks. Daniel didn't flinch. He let Eric's words linger without responding immediately. Instead, he turned back to the jet, his hand brushing lightly over its gleaming surface. "I know what I'm looking for," he said at last, his voice measured and steady. "And I know I'm in the right place." Eric blinked, momentarily caught off guard by Daniel's confidence. But he quickly recovered, his smirk returning with renewed sharpness. "Well, if you say so," he said, taking a step closer and lowering his voice. "But just so you know, this jet is priced at over 7 figures. Not exactly something you find at a farm auction." The jab stung, but Daniel didn't let it show. He had come too far to let the arrogance of a single salesman rattle him. "I'm aware of the price," he replied evenly, his eyes locking with Eric's. "Now, are you going to show me the features, or should I find someone who will?" Eric hesitated. For a moment, his confident facade seemed to falter as he realized Daniel wasn't backing down. But before he could respond, a voice from the lounge area interrupted. "Maybe he's just here to take pictures," a man in a leather jacket said loudly, his tone mocking. "You know, for inspiration or something." Another voice joined in. "Yeah, maybe he thinks this is one of those lottery giveaway contests," a woman added with a smirk, "earning a round." of quiet laughter from those around her. The laughter echoed through the showroom, each chuckle a dagger aimed at Daniel's dignity. He felt his fists clench involuntarily, the weight of their scorn threatening to crack the calm exterior he had worked so hard to maintain. But then he took a deep breath, steadying himself. Daniel had faced ridicule before. He had been doubted by bankers who refused him loans, by neighbors who questioned his choices, and by competitors who underestimated his resolve. Each time, he had proven them wrong, not with words but with action. Today would be no different. He turned back to Eric, his gaze unwavering. "I didn't come here to be entertained," he said, his voice firm. "I came here to buy a jet. If you can't handle that, then find me someone who can." The room grew quieter as his words resonated. Even the customers who had been laughing earlier seemed taken aback by his composure. Eric's smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. Before Eric could respond, Carla, the receptionist, approached hesitantly. "Sir," she said softly, addressing Daniel. "If you'd like, I can arrange for someone else to assist you." Daniel nodded, offering her a faint but genuine smile. "Thank you," he said, his voice softening. "That would be appreciated." As Carla walked away to make the arrangements, Daniel turned back to the jet, his hand resting gently on its wing. Despite the judgment and hostility he faced, he knew he belonged here. This was his dream, and he wasn't about to let anyone take it from him. For a moment, Daniel allowed himself to tune out the room, focusing instead on the vision that had carried him this far. He imagined the jet soaring through the sky, carrying him toward a future unburdened by long hours on the road or the limitations of his past. It wasn't just a plane, it was freedom, independence, and a testament to what hard work could achieve. Behind him, Eric retreated to his colleagues, his smug demeanor replaced by frustration. The other customers, too, began to turn their attention elsewhere, sensing that their taunts had failed to provoke the reaction they had expected. But Daniel wasn't thinking about them anymore. He wasn't thinking about the stares or the whispers. He was thinking about the promise he had made to himself years ago, a promise to never let anyone dictate the limits of his dreams. This was just the beginning, and Daniel Carter was ready to fight for what he deserved. The showroom remained abuzz with muted whispers and glances as Daniel Carter stood his ground near the jet he had set his heart on. The tension still hung thick in the air, but Daniel's composure remained intact. He was determined not to give those who doubted him the satisfaction of seeing him falter. The polished surface of the jet before him gleamed under the showroom lights, and Daniel let his hand rest on its cold metallic body as if drawing strength from it. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the glass entrance door sliding open. A figure stepped in, commanding attention without a word. The man who entered was tall, with a lean, athletic build. He wore a sharply tailored charcoal gray suit that fit him impeccably, paired with polished leather shoes that clicked softly against the marble floor. His hair was neatly trimmed, and a watch with a subtle but unmistakably luxurious design gleamed on his wrist. The newcomer scanned the room with confident ease, his piercing eyes assessing the scene until they landed on Daniel. A moment of recognition passed between them, and the man's serious expression softened into a warm smile. "Daniel Carter," he called out, his voice resonant and familiar. "Well, I'll be. Is that really you?" Daniel turned, his brow furrowing in confusion for a split second before his face lit up with recognition. "Desmond Edwards," he said, a rare smile breaking through his usual stoic demeanor. "What are the odds?" The two men closed the distance between them, and Desmond extended a hand. Instead of just shaking it, Daniel pulled him into a firm, brotherly hug. The moment felt like a brief reprieve from the tension that had filled the room moments earlier. Desmond stepped back, still grinning. "I haven't seen you since high school," he said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "What brings you here, old friend?" Daniel hesitated for a moment, suddenly acutely aware of how different they looked. Desmond exuded a kind of polished confidence that seemed tailor-made for this high-end environment, while Daniel still wore the same mud-streaked boots and weathered shirt that had drawn so much scrutiny earlier. But if Desmond noticed the contrast, he didn't show it. His smile was genuine, his posture relaxed. "I'm here to buy a jet," Daniel said simply, his voice steady despite the lingering murmurs in the room. Desmond raised an eyebrow. Impressed. A jet, huh? Now that's what I like to hear, he said, clapping Daniel on the shoulder. I always knew you had big dreams. The warmth of their reunion seemed to shift the atmosphere, if only slightly. The sharp-edged stares from the other customers softened into more curious glances, though some still carried traces of doubt. Desmond, however, seemed entirely unbothered by the attention. He turned toward the jet Daniel had been admiring and gave a low whistle. She's a beauty, he said, running his hand over the smooth metal. You've got good taste as always. Daniel chuckled softly, the tension in his shoulders easing. Figured it was time to invest in something that makes life a little easier, he said. No more 12-hour drives to make deliveries. This jet could change everything for me and my family. Desmond nodded thoughtfully, his expression turning serious. And you've earned it, he said firmly. Every bit of it. Their conversation drew the attention of Eric Walker, who had been watching from a distance with thinly veiled irritation. The young salesman's confidence, already shaken by Daniel's earlier defiance, seemed further eroded by Desmond's arrival. Eric adjusted his tie and sauntered over, trying to reassert control. Is everything all right here? Eric asked, his tone clipped but polite. His eyes flicked toward Desmond, sizing him up. Desmond turned to face Eric, his smile polite but edged with steel. Everything's fine, he said smoothly. My friend and I were just discussing his plans to purchase this jet. Eric's eyebrows rose slightly, but he quickly masked his surprise. Ah, well, he said, clearing his throat. If there's anything I can assist with. Actually, Desmond interrupted, his tone still courteous but firm. It seems like you've done enough already. The subtle reprimand hung in the air, and Eric's face flushed slightly. He opened his mouth to respond, but thought better of it, retreating with a mumbled, I'll leave you to it. As Eric walked away, Desmond turned back to Daniel, his expression amused. He's a piece of work, isn't he? Daniel shook his head, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. You could say that. Desmond's humor faded slightly as he glanced around the room, taking in the lingering stares and overhearing the occasional whisper. Let me guess, he said, lowering his voice. They've been giving you a hard time since you walked in? Daniel nodded, his gaze steady. Nothing I haven't dealt with before, he said simply. Desmond sighed, crossing his arms as he leaned against the jet. It never gets easier, does it? He said quietly. No matter how much we accomplish, there's always someone waiting to tell us we don't belong. Daniel met his gaze, a flicker of shared understanding passing between them. Though their lives had taken different paths, they had both faced the same barriers, the same doubts cast upon them by others. But you know what? Desmond continued, his voice growing stronger. It's moments like this that remind them, and us, what we're capable of. You're here, Daniel. You've earned the right to be. And no one in this room gets to take that from you. Daniel felt a warmth spread through him at his friend's words. It wasn't just encouragement. It was a reminder of their shared history, of the strength they had both drawn from their roots. You always did know how to give a good pep talk, Daniel said, his lips quirking into a rare smile. Desmond grinned. That's because I believe in you, he said. And I'm not going anywhere until you get what you came for. The two men stood, side by side, their presence together a silent challenge to the room's unspoken prejudice. The whispers quieted, and the judgmental glances grew less frequent as the weight of their solidarity became impossible to ignore. For the first time that day, Daniel felt the tension in his chest begin to ease. He wasn't alone in this fight, not with Desmond at his side. And as he looked back at the jet, his resolve only grew stronger. This wasn't just about buying a plane. It was about proving that no dream was too big, no barrier too high, for someone willing to fight for what they deserved. And with Desmond's unwavering support, Daniel knew he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The atmosphere in the showroom grew heavier as Daniel Carter and Desmond Edwards stood together near the sleek jet. Despite Desmond's confident demeanor and Daniel's quiet determination, the lingering hostility from the staff and customers refused to dissipate. The whispers, once subdued, started growing louder again, emboldened by the fact that Daniel remained unflinching. At the far corner of the room, Eric Walker, the smug salesman who had dismissed Daniel earlier, leaned closer to a group of customers. "Can you believe it?" he said, his voice just loud enough to carry across the room. "They're still standing there like they own the place. You'd think a jet showroom was a museum exhibit or something." A middle-aged man in a tailored navy suit chuckled in agreement. "Maybe he's just here for the free air conditioning," the man added, eliciting more laughter. Daniel heard the words, every syllable like a stone being thrown in his direction. His hand instinctively tightened around the edge of the display counter, but his face remained impassive. He had weathered storms far worse than this, and he wasn't about to let their pettiness break him. Desmond, however, was less composed. His eyes narrowed as he turned to face the group, his voice cutting through the chatter like a blade. "Is there a problem here?" The laughter stopped abruptly as all eyes turned to Desmond. Eric's smug expression faltered, but only for a moment. "No problem at all," he said, his tone dripping with faux politeness. "Just an observation. It's not every day we see unusual guests in the showroom." Desmond took a step closer, his posture radiating authority. "Unusual?" he repeated, his voice calm, but laced with warning. "You mean someone who doesn't fit into your narrow little idea of who belongs here?" Eric straightened his tie, clearly uncomfortable, but unwilling to back down. "I didn't mean anything by it," he said with a shrug. "I'm just saying it's not the typical clientele we're used to." Desmond's eyes bore into Eric's, unflinching. "Well, maybe it's time you redefine typical. My friend here is every bit as deserving of being here as anyone else in this room. Maybe even more." The tension in the room thickened, and several customers shifted uncomfortably, unsure of where to look. Some avoided the confrontation altogether, pretending to inspect the nearby jets, while others watched with thinly veiled interest, curious to see how things would unfold. Daniel, meanwhile, stood quietly, his gaze fixed on the jet before him. He appreciated Desmond's support, but he knew this wasn't Desmond's fight to win. It was his. He placed a hand on Desmond's shoulder, gently pulling him back. "Thanks, Desmond," Daniel said, his voice steady. "But I've got this." Desmond hesitated, his brow furrowed. "Are you sure?" he asked. Daniel nodded. "I'm sure." Taking a deep breath, Daniel turned to face Eric and the group of onlookers. His voice, though calm, carried a weight that silenced the remaining murmurs. "I've spent my entire life working harder than most of you can imagine," he began. "I've faced doubt, judgment, and outright disrespect more times than I can count. But none of that has ever stopped me from going after what I deserve." He took a step forward, his presence commanding. "I came here today to buy a jet. Not to impress you, not to prove anything to you, but because it's something I've earned." The room fell into a stunned silence. Even Eric seemed momentarily at a loss for words, his smug confidence replaced by visible discomfort. Daniel continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "You can sneer, you can whisper, you can make all the jokes you want. But at the end of the day, I'm the one standing here, ready to make a purchase. Can any of you say the same?" A murmur spread through the room, but this time it wasn't laughter. It was a mixture of surprise, discomfort, and perhaps even a grudging respect. "I'll take this one," Daniel said, turning back to the jet and addressing no one in particular. "Tell me what I need to do to make it happen." The declaration hung in the air like a thunderclap, shaking the room to its core. Carla, the receptionist who had been watching nervously from her desk, quickly stood and approached Daniel. "Sir," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I can assist you with the purchase process." Daniel nodded, offering her a small but genuine smile. "Thank you," he said simply. Eric, however, wasn't ready to concede. He stepped forward, his expression a mixture of disbelief and frustration. "Do you even know how much this jet costs?" he asked, his voice louder than necessary. Daniel turned to face him, his expression calm but resolute. "I know exactly how much it costs," he replied, "and I also know I can afford it." Eric opened his mouth to argue, but before he could say anything, Desmond stepped in once more. "You know," Desmond said, his voice smooth and cutting, It's funny how someone whose job it is to sell planes seems so determined to stop a sale from happening. I'd think you'd be a little more accommodating. The jab struck a nerve, and Eric's face turned red. He stepped back, visibly flustered, as Carla ushered Daniel toward a desk to begin the paperwork. As Daniel sat down, he felt a surge of triumph, but it was tempered by the lingering tension in the room. He knew this moment was far from the end of his journey. There would still be obstacles to overcome, battles to fight. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of quiet pride. Desmond joined him, pulling up a chair. "You handled that like a pro," he said, grinning. Daniel shook his head, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I've had a lot of practice," he said. The two men shared a quiet moment of camaraderie, their bond strengthened by the trials they had faced. Together in the last hour, around them, the showroom buzzed with subdued energy, the staff and customers casting furtive glances their way, but saying nothing. For Daniel, this was more than a purchase. It was a declaration, to himself, to the doubters in the room, and to anyone who had ever told him his dreams were out of reach. And as he signed the first sheet of paperwork, he knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. The tension in the showroom had reached a boiling point. As Daniel Carter sat with Carla, beginning the paperwork for the jet purchase, the room was alive with a symphony of murmurs, side glances, and barely concealed judgment. Every corner of the space seemed to buzz with a mix of disbelief, curiosity, and outright disdain. Daniel, however, remained steadfast, his eyes focused on the task at hand. Desmond Edwards stood nearby, arms crossed, and an air of quiet confidence about him. His presence was a silent declaration that Daniel wasn't alone in this battle. Still, even with Desmond by his side, Daniel felt the weight of the room's hostility pressing against him. As Carla explained the next steps, her tone professional but tinged with nervousness, Eric Walker reappeared. The young salesman, whose earlier attempts to undermine Daniel had been thwarted, now looked more determined than ever to regain control of the situation. He approached with exaggerated casualness, his hands tucked into his pockets and a faint smirk playing on his lips. "So," Eric drawled, his voice carrying across the room, "you're really going through with this, huh?" Daniel didn't look up. "That's the plan," he said simply. Eric chuckled. "The sound sharp and mocking. I'm just curious," he said, leaning slightly against the desk. "Do you even know what kind of maintenance costs you're looking at? Or the pilot certifications you'll need? Owning a jet isn't exactly entry-level stuff." Desmond's jaw tightened, and he took a step forward, but Daniel held up a hand, silently signaling him to stand down. Slowly, Daniel turned to face Eric, his expression calm but unyielding. "Eric, is it?" Daniel asked, his voice low and deliberate. Eric nodded, the smirk still plastered across his face. "Eric," Daniel continued, "I've been running my own business for over 30 years. I've negotiated contracts, managed logistics, and navigated challenges you couldn't begin to imagine. So, yes, I know exactly what I'm getting into. And no, I don't need your advice." The smirk faltered, but only for a moment. Eric straightened, trying to maintain his composure. All right, he said, raising his hands in mock surrender. "No need to get defensive. I just hope you're not wasting anyone's time here." At that, Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. He reached into the breast pocket of his shirt and pulled out an envelope. The room seemed to hold its collective breath as he opened it and withdrew a check, its bold numbers visible to anyone who dared to look. The check bore the exact value of the jet, written in crisp, precise handwriting. Daniel held it up, his movements slow and deliberate, allowing the weight of the moment to sink in. "Does this look like I'm wasting anyone's time?" Daniel asked, his voice carrying across the room like a challenge. For a moment, the showroom was utterly silent. The smirks disappeared, replaced by wide-eyed shock. Even those who had been mocking Daniel from afar now found themselves at a loss for words. Eric stared at the check, his face pale and his mouth opening and closing as though searching for a response. Carla's eyes widened, and a small gasp escaped her lips before she quickly composed herself. From across the room, a well-dressed couple exchanged incredulous glances, their earlier derision replaced by visible regret. It was as if the check had shattered the carefully constructed veneer of superiority that many in the showroom had clung to. Desmond couldn't suppress a grin. Now that's what I call making a statement, he said, clapping Daniel on the back. Daniel, however, remained focused. He turned back to Carla, who was now staring at him with a mixture of admiration and unease. Let's continue, he said firmly. Carla nodded quickly, fumbling slightly with her papers as she resumed the process. But the moment was far from over. Eric, clearly rattled, stepped forward again. Sir, he began, his tone now devoid of its earlier smugness. I think there's been some misunderstandings today. If you'd allow me, I'd be happy to personally assist you with your purchase. Daniel met Eric's gaze, his expression unreadable. A misunderstanding? He repeated. Eric nodded eagerly. Yes, exactly. I realize now that maybe I came across the wrong way earlier. That wasn't my intention at all. Desmond snorted, folding his arms across his chest. Funny how attitudes change when money's involved, he muttered loud enough for Eric to hear. Daniel set the check down on the desk, his movements deliberate. You're right, Eric, he said evenly. There was a misunderstanding, but it wasn't on my part. Eric blinked, clearly unsure how to respond. The misunderstanding, Daniel continued, his voice steady but sharp, was you thinking you had the right to judge me based on my appearance. It was you assuming that someone like me doesn't belong here. Eric opened his mouth to speak, but Daniel cut him off. And let me make one thing very clear, Daniel said, leaning forward slightly. I don't need your assistance. Not now, not ever. With that, Daniel stood, slipping the check back into his pocket. Carla looked up, startled. Sir, she asked hesitantly, are you not proceeding with the purchase? Daniel shook his head. Not here, he said. I came here to buy a jet, not to beg for respect. I'll take my business somewhere it's appreciated. The declaration sent another ripple of shock through the room. Eric looked like he'd been slapped, his face reddening as he struggled to find words. Carla looked down at the papers on her desk, clearly unsure of what to say. Desmond grinned, clearly enjoying the scene. You heard the man, he said, his tone light but pointed. We'll be taking our business elsewhere. As Daniel turned to leave, the silence in the showroom was deafening. The customers who had mocked him earlier now avoided his gaze, their faces flushed with embarrassment. Even the employees who hadn't been involved in the ridicule seemed to shrink back, their expressions a mixture of guilt and regret. As Daniel and Desmond walked toward the exit, Eric called out one last time. Sir, please, he said, his voice tinged with desperation. Let us make this right. Daniel paused, glancing over his shoulder. If you wanted to make it right, you should have started by treating me with respect the moment I walked in, he said. But it's too late for that now. With that, he pushed open the glass door and stepped into the warm sunlight outside. Standing by his truck, Daniel took a deep breath, the tension in his chest finally beginning to ease. Desmond joined him, a proud smile on his face. Well, Desmond said, I think you made your point. Daniel nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. It's not about proving a point, he said. It's about knowing my worth, and I won't settle for anything less. Desmond clapped him on the shoulder. And that's exactly why you're going to get everything you've ever dreamed of, he said. As they climbed into the truck, Daniel felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was more than a failed transaction. It was a reminder of the importance of standing up for himself and refusing to let prejudice dictate his path. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he also knew he had the strength to face whatever challenges came his way. And as the truck pulled away from the showroom, Daniel allowed himself a moment to smile, knowing that this was only the beginning of a journey far greater than any one purchase could ever define. The sun was dipping low on the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of gold and amber as Daniel Carter parked his truck in front of his farmhouse. Despite the beauty of the evening, a storm churned within him. The events of the day replayed in his mind. Every sneer, every condescending remark, and every moment of humiliation. Yet, the triumph of walking out on his terms burned just as brightly. He leaned against the truck, staring out at the expanse of his fields, and pulled his phone from his pocket. For a moment, he hesitated. This wasn't the kind of call he wanted to make, but he knew it was necessary. With a deep breath, Daniel dialed the number. Dad! The familiar voice on the other end was warm and steady. Dominic, Daniel said, his voice quieter than usual. I need your help. Dominic Carter, Daniel's eldest son, was no stranger to adversity. A Harvard-educated lawyer with a sharp mind and an unshakable sense of justice, Dominic had built a reputation as a relentless advocate for those who had been wronged. His clients ranged from small business owners to marginalized individuals fighting against systemic discrimination. When Dominic arrived at his father's farmhouse the next morning, he exuded a quiet confidence. His charcoal suit was tailored to perfection, and his polished leather shoes reflected the early sunlight. Despite his professional demeanor, his expression softened when he saw his father standing on the porch. Dad, Dominic said, stepping forward to shake his hand. Thanks for coming, son, Daniel replied, his voice steady but carrying a hint of weariness. Dominic gestured toward the rocking chairs on the porch. Let's sit, he said. As they settled in, Daniel recounted the events at the showroom, his voice calm but firm as he described the blatant prejudice he had faced. Dominic listened intently, his brow furrowing deeper with every detail. By the time Daniel finished, Dominic's jaw was tight, and his eyes burned with quiet anger. They didn't just disrespect you, Dominic said finally. They discriminated against you. That's not just wrong, it's illegal. Daniel nodded. I know, he said, but it's not just about me. This isn't the first time I've faced something like this, and I know it won't be the last. I'm tired of letting it slide. Dominic leaned forward, his hands clasped together. Then let's make them answer for it, he said. Later, that day, Dominic and Daniel arrived at the showroom. The glass facade, which had seemed imposing the day before, now felt more like a fragile barrier, separating arrogance from accountability. As they entered, the receptionist, Carla, looked up with wide eyes. She recognized Daniel immediately, but her attention quickly shifted to Dominic, whose commanding presence seemed to fill the room. Good morning, Dominic said, his voice calm but firm. We're here to speak with the manager. Carla hesitated, glancing nervously toward the office at the back of the showroom. One moment, please, she said, standing quickly and disappearing through a side door. Minutes later, a man in his late 40s emerged. His salt and pepper hair was combed neatly, and his crisp navy suit exuded authority. This was Brian Sterling, the general manager of the showroom. Good morning, Brian said, his tone professional but cautious. How can I help you? Dominic stepped forward, extending a hand. Dominic Carter, he said. I'm an attorney, and I'm here on behalf of my father, Daniel Carter. Brian's expression faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered, shaking Dominic's hand. Mr. Carter, he said, glancing at Daniel. I understand there may have been some issues during your visit yesterday. Dominic's eyes narrowed slightly. Issues is putting it lightly, he said. What my father experienced wasn't just poor customer service. It was blatant discrimination. Brian held up his hands defensively. I assure you, Mr. Carter, that's not representative of how we conduct business here. If there was any misunderstanding, I'd be happy to address it. Misunderstanding? Dominic repeated, his tone sharp. Let's be clear. Your staff didn't misunderstand my father. They judged him based on his appearance, dismissed him, and humiliated him in front of other customers. That's not a misunderstanding, it's prejudice. Brian's expression tightened. I'll admit that perhaps our staff could have handled the situation better, he said carefully. But I'd like to assure you that we take these matters seriously. Perhaps we can offer your father a gesture of goodwill. With all due respect, Dominic interrupted. We're not here for gestures. We're here for accountability. Before Brian could respond, Eric Walker appeared, his expression a mix of nervousness and defiance. What's going on? Eric asked, his eyes darting between Dominic and Daniel. Dominic turned to him, his gaze icy. You must be Eric, he said, the one who thought it was acceptable to insult my father and question his right to be here. Eric's face flushed, but he squared his shoulders. Look, I didn't mean anything by it, he said. It was just a misunderstanding. There's that word again, Dominic said, his voice cold. Tell me, Eric, do you regularly misunderstand customers by mocking them and questioning their ability to afford your products? Eric opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Brian quickly stepped in, his tone conciliatory. Mr. Carter, I assure you, we'll conduct an internal investigation to address this matter. Dominic shook his head. That's not good enough, he said. My father deserves a public apology and tangible actions to ensure this doesn't happen to anyone else. And if you're not willing to take those steps, we'll see you in court. The threat hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Brian glanced at Eric, who looked visibly shaken, then back at Dominic. I'll need to consult with our legal team, Brian said finally. Dominic nodded. You do that, he said. But let me make one thing clear. This isn't going away. You can either handle it here, or we'll handle it in a courtroom. With that, Dominic turned to his father. Come on, Dad, he said. We've said what we needed to say. Daniel nodded, his expression resolute as they walked out of the showroom. Back in the car, Dominic turned to his father. They'll try to sweep this under the rug, he said, but we won't let them. Daniel nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. I knew calling you was the right decision, he said. Dominic smiled back. We're just getting started, he said. The day of the trial arrived under a slate-gray sky, the kind that seemed to echo the gravity of what was about to unfold. Daniel Carter adjusted the collar of his shirt as he stood outside the courthouse with Dominic by his side. His son, dressed in a crisp navy suit, radiated confidence. Dominic placed a reassuring hand on Daniel's shoulder. You've already done the hard part, Dad, Dominic said firmly. Today, we let the truth speak for itself. Daniel nodded, his jaw tightening as he glanced at the imposing courthouse doors. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about sending a message that no one should have to endure what he had. The courtroom buzzed with quiet anticipation as people filled the gallery. Reporters, legal observers, and curious onlookers crowded the seats, drawn by the high-profile nature of the case. At the front, the company's legal team sat stiffly, their polished appearance betraying the tension simmering beneath the surface. Among them was Eric Walker, looking distinctly uncomfortable as he fidgeted with his tie. Daniel and Dominic took their seats at the plaintiff's table, their calm demeanor contrasting sharply with the nervous energy radiating from the defense. The judge, an older woman with a sharp gaze and an air of authority, entered the room, bringing the low hum of conversation to an abrupt halt. All rise, the bailiff announced, and the trial began. Dominic rose first, delivering his opening statement with the precision of a seasoned litigator. Your Honor, today we address not just an incident, but a culture that enables discrimination, fosters prejudice, and undermines the fundamental principles of equality, Dominic began, his voice steady and clear. He turned slightly, addressing the jury directly. My father, Daniel Carter, walked into that showroom with every right to be treated as a valued customer. Instead, he was met with mockery, judgment, and outright humiliation, all because of how he looked and where he came from. Dominic's gaze swept the room, his tone sharpening. But this case isn't just about one man's experience. It's about holding accountable those who perpetuate such behavior and ensuring it doesn't happen to anyone else. The jury listened intently, and even the defense team couldn't hide their unease. The first day of the trial centered around establishing the facts. Dominic called Daniel to the stand, guiding his father through a recounting of the events at the showroom. Mr. Carter, Dominic began, his tone gentle yet firm. Can you describe what happened when you entered the showroom that day? Daniel took a deep breath, his voice steady as he recounted the insults, the dismissive attitudes, and the open ridicule he had faced. As he spoke, the gallery sat in rapt silence, each word painting a vivid picture of the discrimination he had endured. Did anyone step in to stop this behavior? Dominic asked. Daniel shook his head. No, he said. Not a single person. The defense attempted to downplay the incident, claiming it was an isolated misunderstanding. But Dominic was prepared. Your Honor, he said, standing once more, I'd like to introduce evidence that proves this was no misunderstanding, but a pattern of discriminatory behavior tolerated, if not encouraged, by the company. He signaled to the court clerk, who played a recording on the audio system. The courtroom filled with the voices of Eric Walker and other employees, their mocking remarks cutting through the air like knives. Looks like he got lost on the way to the tractor dealership. probably thinks this is a lottery giveaway. This isn't a place for someone like him. The recording ended, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Daniel sat at the plaintiff's table, his hands folded tightly as the weight of the words hung in the air. Dominic turned back to the jury. "These aren't just words," he said, his voice resonant with conviction. "They are weapons, used to demean, to belittle, and to exclude. And they reflect a deeper issue, a corporate culture that allows such behavior to thrive." The defense scrambled to respond. Their lead attorney, a sharp-tongued woman named Evelyn Ross, rose to argue that the comments were made by individual employees and didn't reflect the company's values. "This company has a strict policy against discrimination," Evelyn said, her tone brisk. "The actions of a few employees do not define the organization as a whole." Dominic was ready. "Your Honor," he said, "I'd like to call Amelia Lopez to the stand." Amelia, a junior employee at the showroom, had been the one to secretly record the incident. Her testimony was a critical piece of the puzzle. Amelia walked to the stand, her hands clasped nervously, but her expression resolute. Dominic approached her with a reassuring smile. "Ms. Lopez," he began, "can you tell the court why you chose to record? What happened that day?" Amelia nodded. "I couldn't stay silent," she said. "What I saw wasn't just unprofessional. It was wrong. The way they treated Mr. Carter was unacceptable, and I felt like someone had to speak up." Under Dominic's guidance, Amelia detailed how she had witnessed similar behavior toward other customers in the past, describing a toxic culture where such attitudes went unchallenged. Evelyn Ross attempted to discredit Amelia, suggesting she had a personal grudge against the company. But Dominic quickly dismantled her argument. "Ms. Lopez," Dominic said, "did you benefit in any way from coming forward with this information?" "No," Amelia replied firmly. "In fact, I risked my job by doing this. But I couldn't just stand by and do nothing." As the trial continued, Dominic presented more evidence. Internal emails from management dismissing complaints, testimonies from former employees who corroborated Amelia's account, and statistical data showing a lack of diversity in the company's leadership. By the time Dominic delivered his closing arguments, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. "Your Honor, members of the jury," Dominic said, his voice steady but impassioned, "this case is about more than just my father. It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that no one else has to endure the kind of treatment he faced. And it's about sending a message that discrimination, whether overt or subtle, has no place in our society." The defense, visibly shaken, made one final attempt to argue that the company had taken steps to address the incident. But their words rang hollow in the face of the overwhelming evidence Dominic had presented. As the judge prepared to adjourn for the day, she looked directly at the defense team. "This court takes allegations of discrimination very seriously," she said. "The evidence presented today is deeply troubling, and it warrants thorough consideration." Daniel and Dominic left the courtroom that evening knowing they had delivered a powerful case. But the fight wasn't over yet. The courtroom was heavy with anticipation as Judge Eliza Thornton returned to her seat. Her piercing gaze swept over the packed room, where every face bore a mixture of tension and expectation. The culmination of weeks of legal battles, emotional testimonies, and heated arguments had brought them to this moment. At the plaintiff's table, Dominic Carter sat poised, his jaw tight with resolve. Beside him, Daniel Carter sat silently, his hands resting on the table, but his eyes carried a quiet determination. At the defense table, Brian Sterling and the company's legal team looked far less confident than they had at the trial's outset. The evidence presented by Dominic, particularly Amelia's damning testimony and the recordings of the showroom insults, had left them scrambling for a coherent defense. The room fell silent as Judge Thornton cleared her throat. After reviewing the evidence presented in this case, she began, her voice steady but firm. "It is the court's finding that Carter versus Silver Horizons aircraft sales represents a clear example of discriminatory behavior in a public business setting." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The defense team shifted uncomfortably, their confidence visibly shaken. Dominic's expression remained composed, though a spark of triumph flickered in his eyes. The evidence provided, including recorded statements and eyewitness testimony, the judge continued, clearly demonstrates that Mr. Daniel Carter was subjected to ridicule, humiliation, and racial prejudice by employees of Silver Horizons. Such behavior is not only unacceptable, but a violation of civil rights laws protecting individuals from discrimination based on race. Judge Thornton's voice grew sharper as she turned her gaze to the defense table. The court finds Silver Horizons guilty of failing to maintain a fair and inclusive environment for its customers. This failure has caused harm not only to Mr. Carter, but to the community at large. Brian Sterling slumped slightly in his chair, his face pale. Eric Walker, the salesman whose behavior had been at the center of the trial, sat rigid, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. In light of these findings, Judge Thornton continued, this court orders Silver Horizons Aircraft Sales to pay a fine of $500,000 to Mr. Daniel Carter as compensation for the harm caused to his dignity, emotional well-being, and reputation. A collective gasp swept through the room. Dominic's grip on his pen tightened, his expression still calm, but now edged with satisfaction. The judge wasn't finished. Additionally, she said, Silver Horizons is required to implement mandatory anti-discrimination training for all employees, to be overseen by an independent body for the next 3 years. These measures are intended to ensure that no other individual will face the kind of treatment Mr. Carter endured. The murmurs grew louder, journalists scribbling furiously in their notebooks. But Judge Thornton's words were far from over. As a final measure, she said, her tone steely, Silver Horizons must issue a public apology to Mr. Carter. This apology must be made in writing and shared publicly through major media channels to acknowledge the harm caused and to commit to fostering a culture of respect and inclusion moving forward. The courtroom was silent for a moment, save for the faint shuffle of papers. Judge Thornton's stern gaze rested on both tables before she delivered her final words. This court is adjourned. She struck her gavel, and the room erupted into hushed conversations and audible gasps. Daniel sat frozen, his mind processing the weight of the judge's decision. Beside him, Dominic turned and placed a steadying hand on his father's shoulder. We did it, Dominic said softly, his voice filled with quiet pride. Daniel exhaled deeply, a mixture of relief and triumph washing over him. It wasn't just for me, he said, his voice trembling slightly. This was for everyone who's ever been made to feel like they don't belong. Dominic nodded. And now they know that no one gets to treat you or anyone else like that and get away with it. Across the room, Eric Walker avoided their gaze as he slipped out of the courtroom. Brian Sterling, too, left quickly, his expression grim. But their retreat couldn't erase the weight of the verdict. As Daniel and Dominic stepped outside into the bright afternoon sun, reporters and cameras swarmed them. Daniel raised a hand, politely declining interviews, but Dominic spoke briefly. Today's decision is about more than just one case, Dominic said, his voice steady. It's about accountability, justice, and the belief that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity. My father stood up for what was right, and I couldn't be prouder. As the crowd dispersed, Daniel looked at his son, his eyes glistening. You've always had a way with words, he said. Dominic smiled. I learned from the best. Together, they walked toward their car, the weight of the past weeks lifted from their shoulders. For Daniel, this victory wasn't just a legal triumph. It was a validation of his worth, a declaration that no one could diminish him. As they drove away, the sun shining brightly overhead, Daniel felt a deep sense of peace. His fight had not been in vain. Justice had been served, not just for him, but for anyone who had ever faced prejudice and stood up to say, no more. The sun was high and brilliant as Daniel Carter parked a sleek, rented sedan outside the showroom he had walked out of weeks ago. This time, he wasn't here to be dismissed or belittled. He wasn't here to prove himself. He was here to deliver a lesson. Daniel stepped out of the car, his polished black shoes clicking against the pavement. He adjusted his tailored navy suit, the fabric smooth and sharp, perfectly fitted to his broad frame. A silk tie, deep crimson, added a touch of elegance, and the faint glint of a gold watch on his wrist completed the transformation. As Daniel approached the glass doors, his head held high and his shoulders squared, the staff inside couldn't help but notice. Gone was the man in mud-streaked boots and a worn plaid shirt. In his place stood someone who exuded authority, dignity, and success. Inside the showroom, Carla, the receptionist, froze as she recognized Daniel. Her eyes widened, and her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. She quickly straightened her posture and offered a nervous smile. "Mr. Carter," she stammered, "welcome back." Daniel gave her a polite nod, but didn't stop to exchange pleasantries. His gaze was fixed on Eric Walker, who stood near a display jet, flipping through a brochure. Eric's face blanched as he looked up and saw Daniel approaching. "Mr. Carter," Eric said, his voice faltering. He adjusted his tie nervously, clearly unsure of what to say. Daniel stopped a few feet away, his expression calm but firm. "Eric," he began, his voice steady. "Do you remember me?" Eric nodded quickly, his usual smugness replaced by an awkward hesitancy. "Of course, sir," he said. I'd like to apologize for any misunderstanding during your last visit." Daniel tilted his head slightly, studying Eric. "A misunderstanding," he repeated, his tone measured. "You've used that word before. But let me clarify something for you. What happened wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a lack of respect, a failure to treat a customer with dignity simply because of how they looked." Eric swallowed hard, his face reddening further. Around them, other employees had stopped what they were doing, their attention drawn to the conversation. "I came here," Daniel continued, "because I had a dream I worked decades to achieve. But instead of welcoming me, you judged me. You dismissed me. And in doing so, you underestimated not only my determination, but my worth." The room was silent except for the faint hum of the showroom's air conditioning. Even Carla, who had been busying herself at her desk, couldn't hide her fascination with the scene unfolding before her. Daniel's gaze swept across the room, taking in the faces of the staff and the few customers present. "Let me tell you something," he said, his voice rising slightly, commanding the room's attention. "Respect isn't something you reserve for people who look a certain way or dress a certain way. It's something you give to everyone, no matter where they come from or what they do for a living." His words hung in the air like a heavy weight, and for a moment, no one moved. Eric looked as though he wanted to shrink into the floor, his hands fidgeting with the edge of his brochure. Daniel took a step closer, his voice softening but losing none of its power. "The next time someone walks through those doors," he said, "I hope you remember this moment. I hope you remember that judging someone by their appearance isn't just wrong. It's a mistake that can cost you more than you realize." Eric opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He simply nodded, his expression a mix of embarrassment and resignation. Satisfied, Daniel turned and walked toward the exit. As he passed Carla, he paused briefly. "Thank you," he said quietly, meeting her gaze. "For what?" Carla asked, genuinely surprised. "For treating me with professionalism when others didn't," Daniel said. "It matters more than you know." Once outside, Daniel inhaled deeply, the fresh air filling his lungs. He glanced at the competitor's showroom across the street, its bright banners advertising luxury and service without pretense. Moments later, Daniel entered the competitor's building. The staff greeted him warmly, their smiles genuine and their words welcoming. One of the sales associates, a middle-aged man with a kind demeanor, extended a hand. "Mr. Carter," he said, "it's a pleasure to have you here. How can we help you today?" An hour later, Daniel stood beside his chosen jet, the same model he had admired weeks ago, but purchased from a company that valued him. The sales associate handed him the finalized contract with a smile. "We're honored to have your business, sir," he said. Daniel returned the smile, his heart brimming with a sense of triumph. "Thank you," he said, "and thank you for showing me what true professionalism looks like." As Daniel left the competitor's showroom, the jet's contract tucked safely under his arm, he cast one last glance at the place that had once dismissed him. He felt no anger, no bitterness, only a quiet resolve. With his head held high, Daniel walked toward his future, knowing he had not only achieved his dream, but reclaimed his dignity in the process. The day was clear and bright as Daniel Carter stood on the tarmac, gazing up at the jet he had dreamed of for so many years. Its sleek, polished body glistened under the sunlight, a testament not just to his success, but to the resilience and determination that had brought him to this moment. Behind him, his family gathered, his wife Evelyn, their two children Dominic and Lena, and his young grandson Noah, whose wide eyes sparkled with wonder at the sight of the aircraft. The laughter and chatter of his loved ones swirled around Daniel, but for a moment, he stood apart, lost in reflection. The journey to this day had been anything but easy. Every obstacle, every sneer and whispered insult he had endured in that showroom had tested his resolve. The prejudices he faced weren't new to him. They were the same barriers he'd encountered throughout his life as a black man striving for a better future. But standing here now, with the keys to his dream in hand, Daniel felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel fully before: pride. Not the kind of pride that boasts or belittles, but the quiet, unshakable pride that comes from knowing you've earned every bit of what you've achieved. This wasn't just a victory over a company or a group of narrow-minded individuals. It was a victory over every voice, external or internal, that had ever tried to tell him he wasn't enough. "Grandpa, is it ours?" Noah's voice broke into Daniel's thoughts. Daniel turned, his face breaking into a warm smile. "Yes, Noah," he said, kneeling down to meet his grandson's eyes. "It's ours, and one day, you'll be flying in it too." Noah's grin was contagious, and Evelyn stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Daniel's shoulder. "You've worked so hard for this," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "And you never gave up." Daniel rose, taking her hand in his. "I couldn't have done it without all of you," he said. "This isn't just my dream, it's ours. Every sacrifice we made, every challenge we faced, it brought us here." As the family boarded the jet, the spacious interior felt surreal. Plush leather seats, gleaming wood accents, and state-of-the-art technology surrounded them. But for Daniel, the true luxury wasn't in the design. It was in the freedom the jet represented. Taking his seat in the cockpit alongside a pilot he had hired for the maiden voyage, Daniel placed his hands on the controls. The pilot, a seasoned professional named Carla, smiled encouragingly. "Ready when you are, Mr. Carter," she said. Daniel nodded, a sense of calm washing over him. The engines roared to life, and moments later, the jet began to glide down the runway. As it lifted into the sky, Daniel felt a weight he hadn't realized he was still carrying fall away. The view from the cabin was breathtaking, the world below stretching out in endless beauty. Evelyn sat beside him, holding his hand, while Noah and Lena pointed excitedly at the clouds. Dominic, ever the composed one, leaned back in his seat, a small smile playing on his lips as he watched his father. "Dad," Dominic said after a while, breaking the comfortable silence, "do you realize what you've done? This isn't just about buying a jet. You've shown people that it's possible to rise above the worst of what the world throws at you." Daniel nodded, his eyes still on the horizon. "It's about more than that," he said. "It's about reminding people, including myself, that no one gets to define your worth except you. And when people try to tear you down, you stand taller." As the jet soared higher, Daniel's thoughts turned to the larger implications of his journey. The fight against systemic racism wasn't won in courtrooms or showrooms alone. It was fought in the everyday choices people made to challenge prejudice, to demand better, and to hold themselves and others accountable. His victory wasn't just a personal triumph. It was a reminder that change starts with individuals who refuse to accept the status quo. It was about showing his children and grandson that they could aspire to greatness without apology, and that their dreams were valid no matter who tried to tell them otherwise. The family's journey ended at a private airstrip near their hometown, where friends and neighbors had gathered to welcome them back. As the jet taxied to a stop, cheers erupted from the crowd. Daniel stepped out first, waving to the people who had supported him throughout his life. One by one, the family emerged, the warmth of the community enveloping them like a protective shield. It was more than a homecoming. It was a celebration of resilience, unity, and the unbreakable bonds of community. Later that evening, as they sat around a long table under the stars, laughter and conversation filled the air. Plates of home-cooked food passed hands, and stories of Daniel's journey were shared with pride and admiration. To Daniel, one neighbor toasted, raising a glass. A man who shows us all that no dream is too big. To Daniel, the crowd echoed, their voices ringing with sincerity. For Daniel, the moment wasn't about recognition or accolades. It was about the lesson his story carried, that dignity and perseverance were the strongest weapons against prejudice. As the evening wound down, Dominic sat beside him, looking thoughtful. "Dad," he said, "if you had to do it all over again, would you?" Daniel didn't hesitate. "In a heartbeat," he said, "because this isn't just about me. It's about making sure no one else has to fight the same battles I did. And if my story inspires even one person to stand up for themselves, it's worth it." The night ended with Noah curling up in Daniel's lap, his tiny voice asking, "Grandpa, what's your next dream?" Daniel smiled, kissing the top of his grandson's head. "My dream," he said softly, "is to help you chase yours." Daniel's story isn't just about triumph over adversity, it's a call to action. It reminds us that the fight against prejudice requires courage, resilience, and an unwavering belief in our worth. It's a reminder that every small act of standing up for what's right creates ripples that can change the world. To those watching, how would you respond in Daniel's position? Would you have the strength to stand tall, to demand respect, and to never back down? The answer lies not just in words but in action, in the choices we make every day to challenge injustice and create a world where everyone is valued for who they are, not how they look. Thank you for listening all the way to the end of this story. And remember to hit that subscribe button so you won't miss out on our upcoming inspirational tales. See you in the next one.